Looking back at the response to COVID-19, obviously that was the vast majority of your time here, focusing that energy on the COVID-19 response. What are you most proud of?
Let me start it by saying this. The pandemic was a difficult time. And there are 2,800 families in Maine that lost somebody, to say nothing of thousands of people who are hospitalized. So when I talk about things that I'm proud of, I just want to acknowledge that that pride comes against the backdrop of significant loss that so many people faced. All that said, about a year and change ago, I started seeing on social media that people were having difficulties accessing boosters. This was in late November 2021. And I started seeing it on Twitter, and then I started seeing it more. And then within a couple of days, it was just about everything in my mentions was about, hey, I scheduled an appointment and I showed up and the doors were closed and no one was there. My team and I took a look at that, and we verified that those problems were in fact real and widespread. We huddled with our colleagues at the Maine Emergency Management Agency, and we decided that what needed to happen, and what needed to happen soon, was to open a large-scale vaccine center here in Augusta. You were there when we opened. You covered that for us to help get the word out. But we went from concept to operation within about 96 hours. It wasn't just Maine CDC. It was a great example of government partners working together. It was Maine CDC, Maine Emergency Management, the Maine National Guard, the City of Augusta, and healthcare providers from across the state who came together in 4 days to go from idea to action, all because we spotted a problem and we knew that we needed to respond. When it comes to vaccines, you really only get one shot. I mean, if you've convinced someone that they need to go get a vaccine, the day they decide to go, if something happens that day, it's really difficult to convince them to take time out of their day again. And I was worried that we would lose momentum as one of the most vaccinated states in the country if we delayed in opening this facility or if we didn't open it at all. I am really proud of the way that we spotted a problem, responded to a problem collaboratively, and solved a problem for people of Maine insofar as opening that mass vaccination center at the Augusta Armory.
I know hindsight is 2020, but it also offers a chance for you to look ahead to the next big thing on the horizon. So is there anything that you would have changed about the state's response to the pandemic?
You're absolutely right. I mean, I like to think that all of us are getting better every day. And what I know today is not what I knew 3 years ago, and that is for the better when it comes to being prepared for the next inevitable pandemic. Here's the one thing I think I would have done differently and more deliberately, and that is in general around misinformation, but in particular around the way that we understand science and how science changes. Now, throughout the pandemic, I said things like, well, this is based on what we know today. But I never really unpacked what that means. What that means is that we're learning as we go because that's the scientific process. It's not like 2 + 2 = 4. That was true 3,000 years ago, and it's going to be true 3,000 years from now. But in a brand new novel pandemic, what we know on Monday may not be the same thing we know on Friday. And that's not a bad thing. That's not scientists being wishy-washy and flip-flopping. That's scientists getting better every single day. You shouldn't feel bad that something has changed. You should expect that advice and recommendations will change, not because we don't know what we're talking about, it's because we're getting better at what we're talking about. And I would have been a lot more forthright and deliberate about setting the table around the changing nature of science in that manner. I did so from time to time, but I don't think I did so early enough, and I don't think I did so often enough.
There is still a lot of misinformation out there, and there are still a lot of people who have not even started their vaccine series, let alone get a booster shot. Do you think that there is still a chance to win some people over to convince them that they do in fact need to get vaccinated?
I think there is, Mel. I mean, we're never going to stop having the conversation. Let me start, though, by noting that just here in Maine, as one of the most vaccinated states in the country, well over 90% of people have had at least one dose of a vaccine. So that already starts us off in a really strong position. There are some folks who haven't opted for a vaccine yet, but thankfully their numbers are small. But we're not going to stop. We're not going to stop having the conversation. What are some of the things that might change that? Some of it is continued conversation. Some of it is the fact that billions of doses of vaccines have been administered, generally without any issue. The other thing that I think that will change it, though, is technology. The Novavax vaccine, which came out several months ago, was an alternative form of a vaccine that did not use mRNA. That appealed to a lot of people who had reservations. There's now research underway for nasal vaccines. Now it's a long ways off, but for folks who are skittish about needles or who don't like the technology, a nasal vaccine might be a more palatable option. So we're not going to stop. Some of it entails continued conversations and more data. Some of it is about better and newer technology.
The last briefing was held at the State House on June 30th, 2021, which now seems almost like a lifetime ago. We were all at the State House there to basically have a last hurrah to the state of emergency here in Maine, and also to feel a little bit more hopeful where we were at the time. This felt like more like a celebration of sorts. Was that a little bit premature?
Well, we still continued with our engagement with the public and the media, notwithstanding the fact that the briefings came to an end. I don't think it was premature in the sense that the purpose of the briefings was to convey important news as it was unfolding, and we continued to do that. For example, when we suspended contact tracing in schools, that was in early of 2022. That was during a briefing. So you're right. The last regularly scheduled briefing was back in June of 21, but they still continued thereafter, particularly when there was really, really important news to convey. At no point have we ever taken a victory lap. At no point have we unfurled the proverbial mission accomplished banner. The briefings were one way to convey information, but they were not to be taken as a barometer of how we were doing in the pandemic, or whether things were generally better or whether they were generally getting worse. We went back to them, for example, in August, September, October, November, because there was really important communication that needed to be delivered.
Is there still a way that we can get COVID-19 back under control?
Well, it does depend on what we mean by under control. The variant that was circulating in June of 2021 is significantly different from the substrain of the Omicron variant that we're contending with now. The current strain that's dominant in the Northeast, the so-called XBB strain, is significantly more contagious than anything that we were grappling with back in 2021. So control has a slightly different meaning now than it did way back then. It's still possible, but not on a permanent basis. COVID is going to be with us. COVID as a respiratory infectious disease, it's not going to go away. There will be times of the year when it's more significant. There will be times of the year when it's less significant. But it's going to be a phenomenon that affects individuals as well as our healthcare system, as well as our public health system for the very foreseeable future.
I think some of us, including myself, at one point were hopeful that we could put it back in the proverbial box, that we could, reign control over this virus, that we might see a day where there was no more COVID cases or COVID deaths. Was there ever a chance of that?
If there were such a chance, it was fairly short-lived. Once many people in the public health community saw the various parameters of the COVID-19 virus, its contagiousness, its ability to spread very quickly, its ability to cause infections through aerosol transmission at multiple feet. I think the hope of putting the COVID genie back in the bottle evaporated pretty quickly. The notion that we could control, let alone eradicate it, fell by the wayside for me as a goal very, very quickly. It was supplanted by the goals that I think we have right now, which is to prevent the healthcare system from being chronically overwhelmed, even though the system may be challenged from time to time, and to ensure that individuals who are the most vulnerable have the maximal amount of protection. So, for me at least, there wasn't a period when I thought that that COVID would be bottled up and put away. For example, in the way that with monkeypox and mpox, that was very much a believable and attainable goal, and one that we've largely seen for the time being could change. But with COVID-19 and its various parameters, that was always going to be a difficult goal. And I think we've seen just in recent weeks and months countries around the world that strive for that goal, reckoning with the fact that the Omicron variant is just way too transmissible.
I want to ask you about your time before you arrived at Maine. You were criticized for your handling of repeated fatal outbreaks of Legionnaire's disease at a state-run Illinois veterans home. Do you think your experience with that shaped how you took on the COVID-19 pandemic here in Maine? And do you think you've redeemed yourself for that?
Well, I'll let questions of redemption be answered by others. What I can say is that as humans, we're always getting better every single day. But it's important to note that the same principles that I applied to managing COVID-19, whether it was from using a scientific approach or frequent public communications, are the same principles that we utilized when responding to a Legionnaire's disease outbreak in Illinois. We notified the CDC, we utilized their playbook, and we talked about what we were doing. Unfortunately, these days, every single response to a pandemic is politicized, no matter what it is. Our response to Legionnaire's disease in Illinois was politicized in the same manner that many elements of our response to COVID-19 here in Maine were also politicized. That's an unfortunate byproduct of the way that public health as a field has become politicized and moved away from its very traditional scientific underpinnings.
Early on in the pandemic, 79% of Americans had a positive or favorable view of the CDC, the US CDC, and this is coming from the Pew Research Center. As of October in 2022, 51% of Americans say they've done an excellent or good job of communicating with the public about the COVID-19 outbreak. Of course, the reverse of that is 49% of Americans say that they have done a poor or bad job of communicating this. How do you think that this will impact the agency's handling of COVID-19 moving forward and the way that it responds?
Well, it's a challenge. I mean, what we've seen throughout COVID is that public communication is essential. It's not an optional part of a public health toolkit. It's, in fact, a critical part of it. And the fact that the esteem that the US CDC has held has fallen is a risk. It's an area of concern. I think that's one of the reasons that Dr. Walensky has asked me to join her team because of the good work that we've done here in Maine in talking with individuals and families and the state about what's happening and what they could do to keep themselves safe. But make no mistake, it's a concern. It suggests that there's a lot of work to be done to restore the trust of American people in the work that the CDC does.
How do you prepare people for that kind of future of living with COVID-19 and the changes that we may go through in the years and decades to come?
Well, I think the most important thing is to be really, really direct with people about what we see and what we expect. COVID, again, is not going to be going away. It's going to be with us for the foreseeable future, sometimes better and sometimes worse than others. However, the approach to keeping yourself and your family safe, the crux of that approach hasn't changed. For example, the vaccines that we have with the boosters remain exceptionally good at preventing the harshest impacts of COVID-19, severe illness, hospitalization, and death. The treatments that we have for COVID-19, particularly right now, Paxlovid, remain really effective at keeping people out of the hospital, particularly if they're older or are at risk. But these things require all of us to do some legwork. Earlier, Mal, you asked about folks who haven't yet been vaccinated. Are we in effect giving up on them? My words, not yours. And my answer is no, absolutely not. Just 2 weeks ago at a vaccine clinic here in Maine, there were 3 people who showed up and got their very first dose of vaccine. That was just 2 weeks ago. 3 people decided that that was the day that they were going to go ahead and get their COVID-19 vaccine. So we're not giving up on that approach. We also want folks to make sure they're prepared for the possibility that COVID may come their way. Getting Paxlovid does require some legwork. So I've asked folks to make sure they have a home test ready to go at home. You can get them free from the state of Maine as well as from the federal government. I've asked folks to have a conversation with your doctor's office so you know their protocols for what they want you to do in case you get COVID, what number to call, that kind of thing. So it does require a little bit of preparation, but this is what families are good at doing. We prepare for a lot of eventualities, whether it's a power outage or getting a flat tire. Being prepared in case you and your family get COVID is one more thing to add to that list.
What are you looking most forward to in your new role at the US CDC?
Well, one of the benefits of being in a national organization is making decisions that can move and change the direction of the entire country's public health system. That sort of purview is an awesome responsibility, but it's also one that that contains a lot of excitement behind it because the opportunity to make change extends beyond our state's borders. So that's something I'm really excited about. Now, make no mistake, I'm still going to be working for every single person in Maine. I'm just going to also be working for 330 million other people across the country.
Is there anything that you would like to say to Mainers before you go?
The one thing that I've asked people in Maine to do through 222 media briefings and countless other conversations that we've had is the one thing that I'll ask everyone in Maine to do today, and that is to be kind and to take care of one another.